Hello, and welcome to the Convos Cultural Update. It's great to have you with us. We have a special treat for you today, an interview with the celebrated pianist, composer, band leader, and educator, Arturo O'Farrill, who leads, among many projects and ensembles, the Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra. Arturo was born in Mexico and grew up in New York City, son of the celebrated Cuban musician Chico O'Farrill and celebrated Mexican singer Lupe Valero. He studied at the Manhattan School of Music and Queens College, and he went on to play in many great ensembles, but he got to start playing for the vocalist Carla Bley in the Carla Bley Band. But he also later played with Dizzy Gillespie and Lester Bowie, along with Wynton Marsalis and Harry Belafonte and many, many others. He is currently on the faculty of the Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA, where he is a professor of global jazz studies. Purdue audiences will remember him being here at the 27th Annual Purdue Jazz Festival in January of 2017, where he, along with the Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra, performed a concert called Cuba, The Conversation Continues, and featured at the heart of it, the Afro Latin Jazz Suite. So we caught up with Arturo while he was on vacation in San Diego for a great opportunity to visit. And so here we go, check it out. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Arturo Farrell to the Convos Cultural Update. Arturo, it's great to have you with us. I gather we are catching you on a little bit of vacation in San Diego.
It's really rare for me to take a vacation. I was finally, my staff and my family said, look, just stop, sit, relax. And of course I couldn't do it. I still giving classes and stuff, and it's just, I can't. But yeah, San Diego is beautiful. We've been here for about 5 days, and it's been swimming and just enjoying life for a minute, it's also my birthday a couple of days ago, so that was that. And so, it was a really beautiful couple of days after a very trying series of months. So,
wow, a belated happy birthday.
Thank you.
I guess we all have to work through various modes of quarantine. Sounds like you found a good formula.
We've actually gotten so busy during this quarantine period that I think we've actually gotten busier. We've been doing a lot of activity, a lot of live streaming. We've been putting together a weekly show. The staff has had to redesign the nonprofit work. So I feel like I'm on Zoom meetings from 8 o'clock in the morning till the rest of and then I've also just been appointed an associate dean for equity, diversity, and inclusion at UCLA. So I'm sitting on the COVID panel and a dean's panel, and it's really actually the quarantine brought about the busiest part of my life, the busiest moment in my life.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about the Afro Latin Jazz Alliance, since that has been such a big holder for so many of the things that you do, but you've recently, I guess it was 2019 when the UCLA appointment came into your world. So I'd like to just remind our listeners about the Afro Latin Jazz Alliance and how that is such a great platform for all of the ensemble work and a huge outreach program, or sets of outreach programs that you do.
In 2007, in 2002, I founded the Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra. In 2007, we left jazz at Lincoln Center, which was the birthplace for the orchestra. But I thought it was not the end of the orchestra, so I created a nonprofit for 3 reasons. One, to educate, perform, obviously, and also to preserve a culture that I thought no one else was really preserving, which is really Afro-Latin music creation, whatever that means for you. And so I put together a board of directors. I walked into a school. I begged for money, which I'm very good at. And we created an organization that started with a $40,000 loan from my local bartender. And last year, our operating budget was in the neighborhood of $2 million. In that time period, we put out 5 recordings. We have a concert season. We present other artists. We have a thriving education program where we are in the New York City school system with the residency. We have 35 teaching artists. We had 35 teaching artists in 16 schools serving thousands of children. And we're creating culture and preserving culture, artifacts, scores, parts, oral histories. It's kind of I would go so far as to say it's maybe the greatest work of my life. I feel like it's a huge campfire. And I love writing music and I love playing music, and it's a source of incredible joy to me. But in some ways, that's a very momentary experience. You have the concert setting, the audience is there, everyone's feeling love, and it's just an amazing moment. But this is long lasting. Even if my compositions live on after me, this organization with a little bit of luck will be doing good for the world for many, 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 many years to come. And that fills me with great joy.
Well, I saw that one of the things that you're doing right now, though, is sharing some love with other Afro Latin and Latin musicians who are, because of the pandemic, stuck without work. And so you've got a relief initiative going. More than $30,000, at least according to the goal that was set, has already been raised. That's very impressive. And I'm sure that in the communities that it's serving, because you've focused on New York and New Jersey base of musicians, it seems. That's an incredible effort yet to be doing alongside the regular mission of the organization.
We, the day after, I was supposed to play in San Diego on the 11th or the 12th, I forget. And literally the morning of the 11th or 12th, it was announced that our concert would not go on. And my first thought was, of course, about my musicians and my sons, and they're freelancers. And I remember growing up in a freelance house and realizing that the income stream for a lot of freelancers in New York had just disappeared. And I was very frightened for them. I mean, it's not just because it's not just because my kids were affected, but because of my musicians were looking at no employment. And not only were they looking at no employment, but they're looking at no employment from a place of not having an employment history because they're freelancers. So not only is there no employment, there's no insurance, there's no, it's a mess. And so I put together a fund, and we've raised actually at this point, I think close to $50,000 or $60,000. Our goal is $100,000. Our goal is to keep going as long as there's need, which could be at this point months and months and months. But we've given out, I think, close to 150 grants. Sometimes it's heartbreaking. The applications we get in come from people who are unable to pay their rent. They're unable to put food on their table. They're also incredible artists. I mean, some of the names that cross my desk are people that you and I would recognize. And to be able to help them survive in this time period is a source of great consolence to me, because otherwise we'll lose these people. We'll lose them. They'll move, they'll disappear, they'll stop trying to contribute to life as we know it. And of course, every time you go to a ballet or to an opera or to a jazz concert or to a formal concert, you're seeing people that depend on this living. One of the things I wanted to say is that it was open to not just Afro Latin jazz musicians. Like, I opened it to people in the freelance community because I felt that was a really important thing to do. I felt like a lot of the grand tour organizations in this pandemic are very geared towards a specific community, and nobody has really geared their efforts towards the freelance artist world. And I realized that when we play at Birdland on Sundays, not only are we freelance musicians, but there's freelance stand-up comics, singers, ballet dancers, waiters, waitresses, bartenders. There's a whole community of people whose lives were decimated by this. And so I invited the larger community at large to apply. And in fact, one very serious high point for me was when I was able to help a young man applied for assistance who was a stand-up comedian. Now, I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy. And so I was so happy that I was able to help somebody whose gig is to go into a room filled with strangers and make them laugh. Mm-hmm. I felt really, really good about that, because that is scary stuff. Right. Getting up in front of a room and doing stand-up comedy. I don't know how they do it, but I felt really good about that.
Well, tell you what, we'll put the links down below so we can share that if anybody who watches the interview would like to help this great
Thank
cause.
You.
I mean, it's clear across the cultural landscape that working artists are often flying without a net. And it's just so important to be able to put our money where our mouth is if we say we support culture. And it's made up of institutions, it's made up of facilities, it's made up of individuals, and every level of the ecology needs special support. So thank you for doing that effort, and we'll help the word about that.
It's funny, I'm afraid our governance in this nation has offered no protection for the gig economy. I'm afraid that our elected representatives have turned a very cold shoulder to people who depend on the gig economy. And in fact, it's getting harder. Legislation in both California and New York is coming down the pike that increasingly makes it difficult for people who depend. Freelance gig economy is really huge. And not only has this pandemic affected it, but the absolute lack of moral responsibility that our governments have taken to protect people who don't have a safety net. And it's just, I mean, it affects me deeply.
Well, I think the whole sense of being able to feel and respond within art is a major thread for you, it seems. And when the Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra was here at Purdue in January of 2017, which inauguration day, the center of the program was the Afro Latin Jazz Suite, centered from the album Cuba, The Conversation Continues. And at that particular time, there was a thawing in the relations with Cuba, and there were cultural trips and educational trips happening and things. And obviously there's been a bit of a retreat since then. But how do you, in your mind, do you see framing the conversation about our cultural relationship to Cuba going forward? Because your work was speaking to a lineage of that discussion. Your father wrote the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite, and so in many ways you can't not think of these as that conversation. So in a thread of discussion, how do you think of our relationship with Cuba going forward?
I think Cuba and the United States have had a very tricky marriage for decades. Of course, it was one of those, I hate to say this stuff because it sounds so hateful, but I don't mean it from my perspective, but it was one of those banana republics where we installed a dictator and thought that people would be happy just to serve the needs of the United States corporate interests. And then, of course, Fidel came, and he came out of the mountains and made all kinds of promises to his people that he then had to fulfill. And so when he came to the United States asking for help, appeared before Congress and said, we just literally started, a new life. We need your assistance. And the United States could not let go of its corporate interests long enough to assist these very, very poor people in this little tiny nation in 90 miles southeast of Florida. And that relationship has been stymied ever since. And we owe so much of our cultural identity as musicians to Cuba. And Cuba owes so much of its identity as musicians to the United States that already was interrupted. And when Obama I've been going back and forth to Cuba since 2002. And I sometimes go 4 or 5 times a year. And I've performed, I've brought musicians to study here. I've sent musicians to study down there. I've traveled throughout the island. And what I really found is that when Obama went and started to normalize relations, it was a natural thing to happen. It was a very cohesive moment for me. But of course, what's the lesson? The lesson of Cuba is it's not about political ideology. Here's a nation that we're punishing. Why are we punishing them? Is it because they're communist? No. We do massive amounts of business with Vietnam and China and Russia. Are we punishing them because of civil rights violations? With all due respect, we do business with Saudi Arabia, which was responsible for the murder of a journalist. We do business with China, which has horrendous human rights workers violations. We do business with all kinds of nations that have horrendous human rights records. So if we don't punish Cuba because of communism or human rights violations, or the other great excuse is freedom of press. Actually, Cuba has a free press. It's as dogmatic in its propaganda as we are. We certainly don't have a free press. It costs a lot of money to have a press agent, a publicist. If you want to control the flow of information in this country, it costs a lot of money. And I think we all know that that's no joke. CNN, Fox, Coke, Pepsi, white wine, red wine, it's kind of the same. I think the real cultural reason we are deeply affected by the Cuban people is that somehow for 65 plus years, they've managed to stand up to us and have survived and retained their sovereignty and retained their culture and retained their grace and their ability to survive in the midst of horrifying conditions. So I like to say, Cubans know how to make a party out of a bottle of water and a piece of bread. And that says a lot to their spiritual condition. I'm not talking religion here. It says a lot to the fact that they know how to survive, how to circumvent, and we don't. We actually have the opposite problem. We have a poverty of spirit in the midst of all the tricks and gadgets and toys and accoutrements of a modern society. So what does that say? If they're able to fix their cars, their 1957 Edsels, with a bobby pin, Band-Aid, and some spit, and we go out and lease a new car every year, what does that say? What does that say about understanding that life is about community? It's about the people around you. It's about making a commitment to the moment, not to the present, not to the future. I mean, to the moment, not to the future, not to the past. Cubans are exceptionally powerful people. They control their destiny, and they don't wait for approval. They don't wait for. They are extraordinarily wealthy. They control their destiny, and they know that, and I think that's the greatest riches a person can have, is knowing that they control their destiny, no matter how impoverished they are. We can't take that away from them, and that pisses our people off. That pisses the people in Miami off. That pisses the people in Washington off. That pisses all the people who would like to control us, because if you control people, they're not controlling themselves. So it makes sense that Cuba is a huge threat to the administration and the right-wing war hawks that control government, the government right now. It goes against every grain in their, they just want to control people. So that's why Cuba is scary to them.
Well, I love your analogy about the bottle of water and a piece of bread. I've been reading a Mexican cookbook by Gabriela Camara, and she has restaurants in Mexico and San Francisco. And she, said she's speaking to the paradox that we experience in so many ways here in our country. And so she said, in many ways, Mexicans are despised, yet we love their culture. And,
of course.
And so this is so analogous. We loved jazz music. Yet the jazz musicians had to walk in the back door. And, we have so many examples of this paradoxical behavior. And so culture obviously is a way, whether it's food or music, that can be a gateway to understanding each other. And so that kind of creates a really interesting pivot to me to your work, Fandango at the Wall. And it's you've called it a soundtrack for the United States, Mexico, and beyond. And so obviously there was an inspiration for this project. And why don't you sort of walk through how that all fits together and what it's about? It's an amazing project.
Sure. One of my board members emailed me an article about the Fandango Fronterizo, which is a festival. It's an event that takes place Memorial Day weekends at the border between San Diego and Tijuana. And it was dreamt up by a gentleman named Jorge Francisco Castillo, who was been a librarian in San Diego for 30 years. And then he retired and moved down to Tijuana and started learning son jarocho music and fell in love with the culture and was volunteering to clean trash in the beaches of Tijuana. And in the beach of Tijuana, if you ever visit there, the wall, this horrendous, cancerous structure, it literally goes along the land and into the water. And Jorge looked at it and thought, what a great place for Fandango, which is kind of a jam session, a descarga. And so he got together a committee of people, a committee of protectors of a beautiful cultural reality, and put out the word and invited musicians from throughout the United States and Mexico to meet at the wall itself, to play, to jam, to have the son jarocho tradition of zapateado, which is this kind of a dancing on a tarima, on a board. And there's a very specific set of songs that they sing that are all at once completely improvised and all at once completely structured. I mean, it's an amazing music, first of all. Some of the most beautiful music that I can think of, because it's not elite, it's not created in a Eurocentric fashion, but it has extraordinary depth and sophistication and complexity. And they do this. They literally stand on one side of the wall, on one side of the wall, on the other side of the wall, on the other side of the wall, and communicate through dance, song, and poetry. And the wall is so thin at the San Diego-Tijuana border that it is just a mesh. And you can literally touch the tips of your fingers with the person on the other side of the and so when I saw this, I was moved. I thought it was, I was moved to tears. I thought it was the most beautiful, elegant activism that I could imagine. And this was around the time of the President of the United States descending a staircase and calling my people rapists and drug dealers. This was around the time that this horrendous, hateful man came and started dividing the United States. Not that we didn't have a lot of help, let's face it, but definitely started using that mechanism to advance his presidential designs. And so we contacted my dear friend Kabir Segal, who's been my record producer and friend and confidant and mentor for many years, contacted Jorge. We went down to Tijuana and met with Jorge. He told us about the jaranas and the music and son jarocho, and we asked him if we could bring some folks to celebrate, not to take over, not to be front and center, but to actually co-respect their tradition. And so we went and we brought the Afro Latin Jazz Orchestra, Regina Carter, Antonio Sanchez, the Villalobos brothers, Saba Motalebi, Rahim Al-Haj, and we went to the event. We went to the event and sang alongside the son jarocheros and the people who play this miraculous music. And then later on in the evening, we gave them a concert. And then we also recorded in a courtyard, and we recorded an album and put out a book that Kabir Segal wrote. And there's a documentary coming called Fandango at the Wall. And I think as a classically trained jazz musician, you know, there's all kinds of structures of elitism and constructs of culture around those words. And when I hear the music of Son Jarocho, there's something so powerfully central. It cuts to the core of what art is. And it cuts to the core of what art is supposed to do. Art is supposed to liberate. Art is supposed to liberate the soul of humanity so that we can look at where we're going. And the opposite happens in cultural and elitist performance practice. The opposite happens. People stand up on platforms far away from the audience and you venerate them and blah, blah, blah. This is actually human beings gathering together regardless of your skill set, celebrating community and life. And I think that speaks to me in a way that I really believe that speaks to the politics of my music. Don't believe in these cultural constructs. I don't believe in these elitisms. You know, I believe that the separation between a pianist playing Rachmaninoff and a son jarochero strumming a jarana is a construct. This thing is so beautiful to me because it's all in service of community. It's all in service of unity. It's all in service of celebrating life, which is the opposite of everything that is going on right now.
So, well, that's interesting when we talk about the boundaries that get set up and the disciplinarity that happens certainly at universities. And you're at UCLA, a wonderful storied institution. And I noted with interest that the name of the program where you are at UCLA at the Herb Alpert School of Music is called Global Jazz Studies. And that seems like a very intentional signal on behalf of the institution. And so how does that fit? Is that speaking to this, the challenges of disciplinarity and the way jazz is supposed to be understood today? How?
You know, jazz is this word that was made up by the equivalent of a publicist in the 1920s. And in fact, it was a derogatory term. Mm-hmm. Jazz is really the result of a musical practice, a musical aesthetic that was given to us as a gift of love by people whom we enslaved, and that aesthetic plays itself out in the music. Wherever slaves were brought, they brought that gift of love for hatred, and that includes throughout the Americas. So jazz is not an American invention, even though jazz institutions would like you to believe that, because let's face it, nationalism sells. If you affirm the people that you're selling to, then that helps you sell them more. But actually, to me, the most liberating thing about jazz is that it is global, that it connects us. The thing about jazz that is so beautiful to me is that it's a series of things that happen through Africa that are intermixed, intertwined with performance practice from Spain, the Middle East, and India. And there's a way to trace so much of this culture as a fluid journey, so that by the time it becomes jazz or Latin or salsa or hip hop, it's really the result of a global trail. And so for me, calling something global jazz is more correct than calling it jazz. And I definitely have had this burden. I tried to start global jazz programs at other institutions, but luckily the keepers of the flame, Dr. Steve Losa and Eddie Meadows and James Newton and other people that were already at UCLA had caught that vision as well. And so when they appointed myself and Terrence Blanchard as new faculty, I thought that was a really forward admission that jazz was neither black nor white. It was neither jazz nor Latin. It was both. And Terrence is a fierce proponent of crossing a lot of cultural boundaries. And so I feel like this is a commitment on the part of UCLA to re-envision jazz as a language, a lingua franca of culture in the world. And I think that that's huge. And I'm super humbled by the opportunity to be a part of this. I don't know where it's going to go, because institutional life is always rife with possibility and contradiction, possibility and contradiction, possibility and contradiction. But I have to say, there's an openness at UCLA that I've never experienced in any other institution. It is a storied, elite institution. It is a venerated and highly sought after admission. But there are people at the top in the higher administration who really want to see us, all of us, engage in a global conversation. And I find that inexorably, the thing about the pandemic is that it teaches us that we are a global reality. We are a global family. We're connected to one another in ways that maybe perhaps we'd rather not be. But undeniably we are. And so when you think of yourself as a global citizen, think of yourself as a global practitioner of a global craft, you're embracing something that is bigger than me, you, than this nation, that state, that block. You're admitting that jazz is a language of the future, because it takes us exactly back to where we began. And that's the journey. The journey is to understanding where we came from, where we're going. And you know, I love this music. I love where it's going. I love where some people are taking it. You know, I also think there are people who keep in the little tiny boxes under doilies with plastic slip covers so they can control the flow of power. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's just not me.
Yeah. Well, I've sat on that plastic covered sofa, let me tell you.
The doily is such a great word, isn't it? Doily is one of those words that sounds like what it represents.
That's right.
I can't believe I used the word doily today.
Okay. Well, 3 times, actually.
I do that too. Yeah, I ride things.
You put it on the ride symbol and let it go. So, you know, okay, so here's an interesting parallel. You know, you've talked about COVID being, in some ways, a global unifier. By the same token, we've had people around the world stand up because of the police brutality and killings with George Floyd and so many other names that we can't possibly list them all, yet we should all have them at our fingertips. And so this particular moment also reinforces central themes about our humanity and connectedness. And so, you know, this, when I combine that with knowledge of demographic shifts that are changing the color of the populace. And so in some ways, you know, this question is super easy on one hand, but yet it's profound because, you know, I'm asking myself and I'm asking everyone, where do we go from here? How do we see cultural work animating our understanding? Because it's clear that we're having global discussions about how do we thrive together or how are we not thriving together. And it's rooted in the fact that there are so many things we don't yet understand. It's shocking. After all this time, we still don't understand each other or haven't been willing to do the work to understand each other. So how do you see cultural work in this space, perhaps animating greater understanding?
Culture is one of those words that means so many things to so many people. And when I think of culture, I think of not just art and music, but food and dance and clothing. And culture is the kind of the currency, the glue that creates connectivity between human beings. So all of these things are part of a larger picture. And I think it's a lot harder to turn the lens in and say, I am guilty of racism. I am guilty of sexism. I am guilty of homophobia. I am guilty of tribalism and nationalism. I think that's a conversation that culture really begs. Especially we're talking a lot about global music and global jazz. And I think when you look at the history of our nation, which, by the way, I wanted to say this a long time ago. I love the United States. I don't know if I love the nation, but I love the communities I visited, the people I've played for. I've traveled throughout this nation, and I've found huge-hearted human beings. So some people think I'm like anti-American. I'm not. I love places in this contiguous landmass that are filled with heart and hope and soul and beauty and understanding. So that's not the issue. But I think that we need to look at music as a conduit in which we understand the journey inward. The journey inward says, deal with your house before the revolution can begin, you know? And when we listen to the messaging of Beethoven, Sly and the Family Stone, when we listen to the messaging of Albert Ayler, when we listen to the messaging of Bach, when we listen to the messages are all about look inside, change your heart, change your soul, change yourself. Do not accept mediocrity in the way you treat people. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Don't accept mediocrity in the way you look at yourself even. Come to terms with who you are. And I feel like in that sense, people like accuse me all the time of being political. I don't feel I'm political at all. I don't feel I'm a political artist. I am just responsive to what I think art is. And art is about asking myself, hard questions, and with a little bit of luck, having you accompany me on that journey. It's not about trying to get political or attention or social. It's not about that. It's about saying the cultural journey is inward. And until we deal, and I mean that like in the micro sense and in the macro sense, until we deal with that as a city, as a block, as a state, as a nation, until we deal with acknowledging the unbelievable hubris of a people that have terrorized the planet for hundreds of years, until we can see that clearly. And music and art and theater help us do that. Until we can see ourselves for what we are, we're going to continue this pattern. And I have to say to you that we spoke earlier about the idea that I would never have predicted this low point in our history, the moral abyss that occupies the White House. I would never have, and never in my million years would I have imagined the things that I've seen, the lying and the political conspiring and the criminal activity that comes from the highest levels of government. I've also would have never believed in my entire life that we would have seen hundreds of thousands of people marching arm in arm. I would have never predicted that. And I'm so, proud is too small a word. It's too small a word to contain what I feel for people who do this, people who are involved politically, but people who speak out and march and use their bodies and their mouths and their words and their art and their jobs and their styles and their functions to create this conversation and demand that it takes place. That is culture.
Right. That's right. So with that inward look that you do for yourself in this new landscape where maybe gigs and festivals are not so easily found on the horizon, what's next for you? You had the album 4 Questions you've got the documentary coming out December maybe, or somewhere yet this year for Fandango at the Wall. And eagerly await being able to see that and celebrate especially the Son Jarocho culture that's part of that. But what's next for you?
was I was commissioned by the Fine Arts Department at Columbia to compose a piece for the Miller Theater for the Year of Water. This is the Year of Water. So I thought about elitism, and I thought about cultural constructs of performance versus participant and spectator, and the shared space that we all have. And I saw the play Fairview. I don't know if you've seen Fairview, but it's about that shared space. It's about who gets to tell the tale. It's about the horrendous way that we're treating the water resources of this planet. It's about the politicization of water, the monetization of water. It's about, so I wrote a piece called Mundo Agua, which I'm really, it sounds like I'm egotizing. I'm not. I just really feel like I've touched musically I've touched aesthetics that I feel in my heart. And they have to do with the transference of sound through our bodies and the fluidity of how we experience musical events. That if we actually separate ourselves as audience and spectator and artist, we're not fully partaking of the fluidity that we all share. So I've written that piece. I've also been stuck in a small apartment with my wife and son, and that's actually turned into one of the biggest blessings of my life, because you never ever get to parent twice. And something has happened where my son and I have approached each other and rediscovered a relationship that had long ago been cast to done that, been there. I'm adult, you're the parent. So we're going to be releasing an album. I don't know what it's going to be called, but we're going to be releasing an album of a concert that we did for the Green Space that is honestly amongst some of the most beautiful, soul-searching, personal music I've ever played in my life. And then other things that we're doing, we're producing a weekly, as soon as the pandemic hit, I thought about our Sunday night residency at Birdland, and how every week for 25 years I've gotten together with my friends and played music in a public setting, and that disappeared. And so we started something called Virtual Birdland, which is just basically a recording of us playing every week, but it's really fun. It's almost real time. It's almost a synchronous event because we all love each other and know each other so well. So when you put on headphones and you hear the rhythm section and you play, it is an instantaneous occurrence, like if we were sitting in the same room, and that energy comes through. And every week we've put on this event. It's an Amazon Premiere thing and a Facebook Afro Latin Jazz Lines thing, and we just continue to perform. I realized that our job as musicians was to continue to make music. That's our job. We can't abdicate it, no matter what's going on. And I thought about it for a while. Things got really hairy, and I thought, wow, we're celebrating. We shouldn't be celebrating, but we're not celebrating. We're affirming. And so we've been doing that every week, and it's been really amazing. We've been creating great music. What else? I have all kinds of, I'm starting, well, I shouldn't announce this because I've done this 3 or 4 or 5 times in my life. I started to write a book. I started to write a book called Parenting by Confusion. And the premise of it is very simple, that one must parent oneself. One cannot blame their biological parents forever. One cannot look to self-help books or governments or institutions to parent themselves. And so I think sometimes if you listen closely to the messaging that you get from your biological parents, from governments, from institutions, you'll learn as much what not to do as you will learn about what to do.
Right.
And I think the trick is to kind of start listening very, very deeply to, again, that inward journey that will you'll find yourself if you care. If you don't, you'll listen to what people tell you to do.
All right. Well, this has been a great opportunity for me and for our audience to have a chance to check in with you. And
Thank you.
It's so important that when we get to listen to your music, it's undeniable that we feel the rhythm and our feet are tapping and our heads are bobbing. We want to be on the dance floor, perhaps, depending on the moment. But we are also asked to engage with our mind and our heart and our soul. And that comes through in your music, and it comes through talking to you. So thank you for taking this time to share. And we know that we send all of our audience's love to you. Know that you're part of our community, and that doesn't go away. We're still connected in that sense. And so we send our best to you and to the whole ensemble, and to everyone at the Afro Latin Jazz Alliance. So
that means the world to me. Thank you so much for this privilege, and I'm there, with you as well.
All right. Well, thanks so much, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. Okay, thanks. That's a wrap for our interview with Arturo O'Farrill, and we knew that we'd have the opportunity to have a deep and rangy discussion with him, and of course, did not fail. I want to offer my special thanks to Arturo and his manager for helping arrange this opportunity. And of course, we thank you for your continued support of our work here at Convocations. Okay, that's a wrap for this week. Thanks again. Be well, be safe, and we'll see you again soon.